Let me ask you something most newlywed couples never actually talk about before their wedding night, even though it's on both of their minds. What do you actually need to know physically and emotionally before that moment, beyond what movies and awkward jokes from friends have told you? In my years as a urologist, I've had this conversation more times than you'd expect, usually with a nervous groom sitting across from me a few weeks before his wedding, asking questions he clearly hadn't asked anyone else, and almost every time, the anxiety isn't really about what people assume. It's about the absence of any honest clinical information to replace the myths, jokes, and unrealistic expectations most people grow up with. I'm Dr. Emily Carter, and today I want to walk through what couples actually benefit from understanding before their wedding night, the physical realities nobody explains clearly, the psychological factors that matter more than most people expect, and how to approach that first night in a way that sets the tone for a genuinely healthy, intimate relationship going forward. Before we get into it, if this kind of honest, clinically grounded conversation is what you've been looking for, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know you're here. Let's get into it. Here's something I want to establish clearly at the outset. The wedding night carries an enormous amount of built-up expectation, often disproportionate to what it actually needs to be. Culturally, it's treated as this singular defining moment, and that framing alone creates pressure that works against the very thing couples are hoping for, a genuine, comfortable, connected experience. I've seen this pattern repeatedly in my practice. Couples who've built up months, sometimes years, of anticipation around one specific night, only to find that the anxiety and pressure surrounding it actively worked against the physical and emotional experience they were hoping for. Understanding the actual physiology and psychology involved doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It genuinely changes outcomes, because so much of what determines whether that first experience feels positive comes down to managing expectations and reducing unnecessary pressure rather than anything mechanical. Let's start with what's actually happening physiologically, because this is where I see the most significant gaps in understanding for any couple. Regardless of prior experience level, genuine physical readiness depends heavily on the nervous system being in a relaxed, unhurried state rather than an anxious one. When someone feels nervous, rushed, or under pressure, which is extremely common on a wedding night given everything surrounding it, the body's stress response activates, and this directly interferes with the physiological processes needed for a comfortable, connected experience. This is particularly relevant for anyone experiencing intercourse for the first time. The body requires time, patience, and a genuinely relaxed state to allow full physiological readiness to develop. Rushing this process, whether due to nervousness, unrealistic time expectations, or simply not understanding that this takes longer than most media portrayals suggest, often leads to unnecessary discomfort that has far more to do with insufficient time and elevated anxiety than any physical abnormality. I always tell couples preparing for this that there is no prize for speed here, and treating the wedding night as something that needs to happen a specific way on a specific timeline works directly against a positive experience. Slowing down, communicating throughout, and giving the process the time it genuinely needs makes an enormous difference. I think one of the most valuable things I can offer any couple preparing for this is a realistic picture of what's actually normal. Because so much of the anxiety surrounding this night comes from comparing an expected experience against an unrealistic, often media-driven template. It is entirely normal for a first experience to feel awkward, to require adjustment, to not go exactly as either partner imagined. It is normal for nervousness to affect physical response for men, sometimes making arousal or performance feel less straightforward than expected, purely due to anxiety rather than any underlying issue. It is normal for discomfort to occur, particularly without adequate time or lubrication. And this is a physical reality worth planning for rather than something to feel embarrassed about if it happens. None of these things indicate a problem with the relationship with either partner's body or with the marriage itself. They indicate exactly what you'd expect from a nervous, significant first experience carrying a substantial amount of built-up cultural weight. Couples who understand this going in tend to navigate the actual night with considerably more grace and considerably less unnecessary distress than couples expecting something seamless and effortless. I strongly encourage every couple I speak with to have an honest conversation before the wedding night itself, not necessarily about explicit specifics, but about expectations, concerns, and comfort levels. This includes discussing any anxiety either partner is carrying, whether that's about physical discomfort, performance concerns, or simply general nervousness about the unknown. It includes discussing pacing, that there's no requirement to rush, and that taking time is not only acceptable, but genuinely beneficial. It includes discussing that communication during the experience itself. Simply checking in with each other is not awkward or unromantic. It's one of the most effective tools available for ensuring both partners feel comfortable and safe throughout. Couples who have this conversation beforehand consistently report a more positive experience than couples who avoid the topic entirely and simply hope things work out naturally. Removing the mystery and replacing it with honest communication reduces anxiety significantly. And anxiety, as we discussed earlier, is one of the biggest obstacles to a genuinely comfortable, connected first experience. I want to take a moment here because preparation and understanding your body is a theme that runs through everything I discuss on this channel, not just this specific topic. That's actually the entire idea behind a complete resource I put together called the Iron Age. It covers the full picture of men's health, testosterone, sleep, strength, stress, prostate health, and yes, the physiology and psychology of intimacy so that men aren't left guessing about their own bodies at any stage of life, including moments as significant as this one. For $49.99, it's a resource you can reference for years, well beyond just this one night. If you found these videos helpful, I genuinely encourage you to check it out. The link is below. I want to speak directly to the grooms watching this because performance anxiety around the wedding night is extremely common, far more common than most men are willing to admit, even to close friends. The anticipation surrounding this specific night, combined with its cultural significance, creates exactly the kind of pressure that activates the stress response we discussed earlier, the same stress response that can interfere with physical arousal and function. This becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Worry about performance increases anxiety, which can genuinely affect physical response, which then increases worry further. Understanding this cycle in advance is genuinely protective. If nervousness does affect things in the moment, understanding that this is a normal, physiologically explainable response to significant anxiety, rather than a sign of any deeper problem, helps prevent that moment from spiraling into greater worry. Most couples navigate an imperfect first night successfully, specifically because they don't treat a hiccup as catastrophic. They treat it as a normal part of a nervous first experience and move forward together. If there's one message I want every couple to take from this conversation, it's that the wedding night does not need to be, and honestly shouldn't be, treated as a singular defining moment that has to go a specific way. What actually matters, both for that night and for the intimate relationship you're building together going forward, is genuine connection, patience, and communication. Couples who approach this night with realistic expectations, open communication, and patience with each other consistently report far more positive experiences than couples chasing an unrealistic ideal. And more importantly, the habits you build on that first night, communicating openly, prioritizing each other's comfort, treating nervousness or imperfection with grace rather than anxiety, tend to set the tone for the entire intimate relationship that follows. I've had patients years into their marriage tell me that understanding this framework beforehand didn't just help their wedding night, it shaped how they approached intimacy with their partner for years afterward, treating it as an ongoing conversation and practice rather than something requiring flawless execution from the very beginning. A few practical points worth keeping in mind. Give yourselves genuine, unhurried time rather than treating the night as something to move through quickly. A basic water-based lubricant is a practical, sensible tool to have available, and using it isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's simply a reasonable accommodation for a nervous first experience. Communicate throughout, simple check-ins about comfort rather than assuming everything is fine without confirming. And if anything feels uncomfortable or doesn't go as expected, treat it with patience rather than distress, since a single night does not define a marriage or an intimate relationship. If physical discomfort persists beyond what seems reasonable for a first experience, that's worth mentioning to a doctor, since occasionally there are underlying physical factors on either partner's side worth addressing directly rather than assuming will simply resolve on their own. I want to address something that makes this specific night different from ordinary intimacy discussions: the cultural and family weight that often surrounds it, particularly in communities where the wedding night carries significant symbolic importance beyond just the couple themselves. In many cultural contexts, there's an unspoken awareness that extended family, tradition, and social expectation are, in some way, present in the background of that night, even when no one else is physically there. This creates a layer of pressure that has nothing to do with the couple's actual readiness or compatibility and everything to do with external expectation. I've spoken with patients who described feeling as though they were performing for an invisible audience rather than simply being present with their new spouse. Recognizing this pressure for what it is, an external cultural weight rather than a reflection of anything real about the relationship, is genuinely helpful. Couples who can name this pressure explicitly, acknowledging to each other that they feel it, tend to diffuse some of its power simply by bringing it into the open rather than carrying it silently and separately. This is worth discussing directly as part of the broader conversation I mentioned earlier, not because the pressure will disappear entirely, but because shared acknowledgement of it reduces the sense of isolation that makes it feel so much heavier. Something I've noticed varies enormously between couples is prior exposure to accurate information, and this variance significantly affects how the wedding night actually unfolds. Couples who arrive with some baseline understanding of anatomy, arousal, and what to realistically expect tend to navigate the night with considerably more ease than couples who arrive with little more than cultural myth, movies, or silence to draw from. This isn't about prior physical experience, which is an entirely separate consideration. It's specifically about accurate information, understanding basic physiology, realistic timelines, and common first-time experiences, regardless of whether that information comes from a doctor, a trusted resource, or an open conversation with a partner or premarital counselor. I've had patients whose only prior exposure to this topic came from exaggerated or unrealistic sources, and the gap between those expectations and reality created far more distress than any actual physical difficulty did. Conversely, I've had patients who sought out accurate information beforehand, sometimes specifically scheduling a conversation with me or another doctor in the weeks leading up to their wedding, and those couples consistently described a considerably calmer, more grounded experience, even when things didn't go perfectly. This is precisely why I think conversations like this one matter. Not because they provide some magic formula, but because they replace inaccurate assumptions with realistic, medically grounded expectations, which on their own reduce a significant portion of the anxiety driving a difficult first experience. I want to address this directly because it's common, rarely discussed, and often becomes a source of significant unnecessary distress when it happens without anyone having prepared the couple for the possibility. It is entirely normal for a first attempt to not proceed as expected, whether due to physical discomfort, nervousness affecting either partner's physical response, or simply the unfamiliarity of a completely new experience. This does not indicate a problem with the marriage, with either partner's body, or with their compatibility. It indicates exactly what a reasonable person would expect from a significant, novel, emotionally charged first experience. Couples who understand this possibility beforehand tend to respond with patience and reassurance toward each other if it happens, treating it as simply needing more time rather than spiraling into worry, blame, or shame. Couples who haven't been prepared for this possibility, on the other hand, sometimes interpret a difficult first attempt as a sign of a deeper problem, which can create lasting anxiety around intimacy that takes considerably more effort to work through later than it would have taken to simply expect and normalize the possibility from the outset. My clinical advice here is straightforward. If the first night doesn't go as smoothly as hoped, that's not a failure requiring immediate intervention. It's an invitation to slow down further, communicate more openly, and try again with even more patience, whether that's later that same night, the next day, or whenever both partners feel ready. There is no deadline requiring consummation on a specific timeline, despite the cultural pressures suggesting otherwise, and removing that artificial deadline often resolves the underlying tension driving the difficulty in the first place. I want to mention a few specific physical realities that are worth understanding in advance, simply because unexpected surprises tend to generate more anxiety than the same experience would if anticipated beforehand. For some individuals, initial discomfort or minor bleeding can occur during first intercourse related to normal anatomical factors. This is common, generally minor, and not typically a cause for concern, though persistent or significant pain beyond what would be reasonably expected is worth mentioning to a doctor rather than assuming it will simply resolve. For men, it's worth understanding that nervousness genuinely can affect physical arousal and function in the moment, purely as a result of anxiety rather than any underlying physical issue, and this is far more common on a wedding night specifically than in ordinary circumstances, given the unique pressure involved. Understanding these possibilities in advance doesn't guarantee they won't happen, but it significantly changes how a couple responds if they do. Anticipated, understood difficulties tend to produce patience and reassurance. Unanticipated difficulties tend to produce panic, self-blame, or worry that something is fundamentally wrong, none of which is warranted by what is, in most cases, a normal response to a significant, nerve-wracking first experience. I think it's worth zooming out briefly to consider why getting this right, or at least approaching it with the right framework, matters beyond just the night itself. The patterns couples establish around communication, patience, and mutual care during this first significant intimate experience often set a template that carries forward into the broader intimate relationship for years afterward. Couples who learn early to communicate openly about comfort and preferences rather than assuming or guessing tend to maintain that habit going forward, which research consistently links to greater long-term relationship satisfaction. Couples who learn to treat imperfection or difficulty with patience and reassurance rather than anxiety or blame tend to carry that same resilience into how they handle other challenges within the relationship more broadly. In this sense, the wedding night isn't just a single isolated event. It's often the first real test of how a couple handles vulnerability, uncertainty, and imperfection together, and the patterns established in that moment tend to echo forward in ways that extend well beyond intimacy specifically. I also want to briefly address something that comes up often: couples where one partner feels considerably more nervous, uncertain, or unfamiliar with this topic than the other. This asymmetry is extremely common and on its own isn't a cause for concern, though it's worth acknowledging directly, rather than assuming the more comfortable partner's pace should simply apply by default. The partner who feels more nervous or uncertain should feel genuinely empowered to set the pace, ask questions, and voice concerns without feeling as though they're holding things up or disappointing their partner. The more experienced or comfortable partner, in turn, benefits enormously from actively checking in and prioritizing patience over their own comfort level or expectation. Couples who navigate this asymmetry with explicit communication, rather than one partner silently deferring to the other's assumed comfort level, consistently report a considerably better shared experience than couples where this imbalance goes unspoken. I'll close this section with what I consider the single most important reframe I can offer any couple preparing for this night. It does not need to be perfect, and it does not need to look a specific way to be a genuinely meaningful, positive beginning to your intimate life together. The couples who look back on their wedding night with the most warmth aren't necessarily the ones where everything went exactly as planned. They're the ones who approached it with patience toward each other, who treated any awkwardness or difficulty as simply part of a nervous, meaningful first experience rather than a problem to be anxious about, and who prioritized genuine connection over any specific outcome or timeline. That framework, more than any specific piece of physical knowledge, is what actually determines whether this night becomes a positive foundation for the years of intimacy that follow. One piece of practical advice I give to nearly every engaged couple who comes to see me: consider a simple pre-wedding check-in with a doctor. Not because anything is necessarily wrong, but because it's an easy opportunity to ask questions neither partner may feel comfortable raising anywhere else. This doesn't need to be an elaborate appointment. For many of my patients, it's a short, straightforward conversation covering basic anatomy, realistic expectations, and any specific concerns either partner has been quietly sitting with. For women, this is also a reasonable time to discuss any anatomical questions or concerns with a gynecologist, particularly if there's any known history that might affect comfort or ease during first intercourse. For men, it's an opportunity to raise any anxiety about performance directly with a doctor who can offer real reassurance grounded in clinical experience rather than guesswork. I've found that couples who take this step consistently arrive at their wedding night with less anxiety simply because they've had the chance to ask questions in a low-pressure, judgment-free setting beforehand. It replaces uncertainty with clarity, and as we've discussed throughout this video, uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers of the anxiety that interferes with a positive first experience. I also want to gently push back on the idea that the wedding night needs to be a single, complete, defining event at all. For many couples, the early days and weeks of marriage represent a gradual process of becoming physically and emotionally comfortable with each other, not something that needs to be fully resolved in a single night. This reframe alone tends to relieve an enormous amount of pressure. If the wedding night itself feels incomplete, awkward, or simply doesn't unfold the way either partner imagined, that's not a deadline miss. It's one part of an ongoing process that continues over the following days and weeks, as both partners grow more comfortable, more communicative, and more attuned to each other. Couples who understand this from the outset tend to feel considerably less urgency and considerably more patience with themselves and each other, both on the night itself and in the days that follow. Finally, I want to mention something that often gets overlooked entirely in these conversations: the emotional check-in that should happen afterward, regardless of how the night went. Simply asking each other how you're feeling, whether physically, emotionally, or both, and genuinely listening to the answer reinforces exactly the kind of open communication that supports a healthy, intimate relationship long-term. This matters just as much after a night that went smoothly as it does after one that didn't. Couples who build this habit of checking in afterward, rather than assuming everything is fine or moving on without discussion, tend to strengthen the emotional foundation of their relationship in a way that extends far beyond this single night. It's a small habit, but it's one of the most consistently valuable ones I recommend to every couple I speak with. So here's what I want every couple preparing for their wedding night to walk away with. This night carries an enormous amount of cultural weight, far more than it needs to. What actually determines a positive experience isn't flawless execution or matching some unrealistic expectation. It's patience, honest communication, realistic expectations, and treating each other with genuine care throughout. The physical and psychological realities we've discussed today, nervousness affecting the body's readiness, the importance of unhurried time, the value of open communication, are normal, expected, and manageable, not signs that something is wrong. Couples who understand this going in consistently navigate their wedding night and the years of intimacy that follow with far more confidence and far less unnecessary anxiety. If this was helpful, or if you wish someone had explained this to you before your own wedding night, let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you want more honest, clinically grounded conversations about men's health and relationships like this one. I'll see you in the next video.